Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to some of you. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion on student wellness and international travel. We're really excited by the panel that we've assembled today. It really represents a broad perspective on student wellness, well-being, and travel, and in particular for international internship programs. So thank you for joining us today. I see there's 72 people online right now. We had about 180 register, so that is great news. I may be repeating myself. I understand that it is election day in the United States, so I suspect that might hurt our attendance a little bit, but for a very good reason. So if you have to leave a bit early to go vote, and you want to catch the end of our presentation, it will be recorded and posted online shortly. I want to let you know that this session will focus on new and emerging well-being considerations as students and young people return to international travel in significant numbers. Topics to be discussed are access to healthcare, mental health support, LGBTQ plus security, religious tolerance, security of girls and women, and health, safety, and security communication strategies. Today's session is sponsored by International Experience Canada, and actually was kind of the genesis of why we put this session together. Quite a while ago, they asked me if I knew of any good resources that would show not just how the COVID epidemic was being experienced in various countries around the world, because there were some really good data from certain organizations. So CIEE particularly comes to mind with that. But they were asking about a pretty comprehensive health, safety, and security platform that would show various issues that affect student mobility programs. And so that sort of led me to thinking about this particular theme, and I've reached out and put together this panel. Before we begin, I'd like to announce that the International Internship Conference will be happening next year in. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my slide right now. Will be happening next year in Indianapolis at the Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis campus. So that will be taking place June 13th to the 15th of 2022. The call for proposals is currently open. So if you go to our website, internship-network.org, you can find a way to submit a proposal. The deadline for that is December 15th of 2022. And registration, while it should have been open by now, I was having some technical issues, will definitely be open on Monday. So please feel free to go to our website on Monday and consider registering or seeing what is what's involved in putting a proposal together. So at this time, I'd like to actually call on Colin Lalonde with International Experience Canada. Colin will provide land acknowledgement for where he is sitting, and also give us an update on International Experience Canada. So over to you, Colin.
Thanks a lot, Matt. So my name, as Matt said, is Colin Lalonde, he, him. And I'm speaking to you today from Tioiti Ke, or Montreal, which is the historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, the Kanyen Kehaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters in and around the city. I'm sure most folks on this call are joining from other places in Canada and around the world that may be the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. So I encourage you all to take a moment at some point today to acknowledge, appreciate, and learn about the traditional stewards of the land that you live on and enjoy each day. So today I'm here representing International Experience Canada, the Government of Canada's Youth Mobility Visa Program, which is often referred to as a working holiday visa. It allows Canadians between 18 to 35 to work and travel in any of over 35 partner countries and territories, and for youth citizens from those countries to work and travel in Canada as well. IEC work permits make it cheaper, faster, and easier to work and travel abroad. Work permits can be valid for up to 2 years, depending on the country's specific requirements, such as age limits, duration of stay, and work restrictions. In short, IEC is pretty simple. It's a cheaper, faster, and easier work permit for young Canadians. Our role as the Government of Canada is to negotiate with partner countries and territories to expand these opportunities for Canadian youth to more countries and ensure that our partners are making the application process simple and accessible as possible. We also facilitate the processing of work permits for the youth of our partner countries and territories to come to Canada, and to raise awareness among Canadians of the opportunities available to them through IEC. So from the young client's perspective, this is a fully self-directed program. And while it's true that IEC makes it cheaper, faster, and easier to work and travel abroad for them than an alternative work permit scheme, we know that the concept of easier work and travel experience is relative. It's not equally easy for folks to work and travel abroad on an IEC visa. There are persistent barriers for youth to take advantage of the opportunities that are available to them, and those barriers can be significantly more pronounced depending on one's unique intersection of social identities. From class to race to sexuality and gender, or if one lives in rural Canada or lives with a disability, there are particular considerations that need to be taken into account when going on a work and travel experience abroad. From speaking to young people, I know that sometimes these barriers can seem insurmountable, and many Canadian youth write off the concept of working and traveling abroad entirely based on that perception. IEC wants to see a world where that's no longer the case, which is why we partner with organizations well placed to support youth, conduct and share research, and engage in conversations like this to explore best practices and create a network of support and empowerment for young people to explore the world. So I'm honored to be a part of this panel, and I look forward to learning and sharing with you all today. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you for starting us off. Before we begin with the questions, I just want to address something. Last week at my alma mater, two international students from China who were attending King's College University and Western University died in a road accident. So our thoughts go out to their families and friends of their community. And it brings home what we do every day, which is as much as we want students to go abroad and have international experiences, we also have to think about mitigation of risks and the inherent risk that comes with that as well. So I'm thinking of them as we're going to be having this discussion today. To introduce the panel, so I'll introduce myself again. My name is Matt Burns. I am the president of the International Internship Network. Melkin Ramos will be helping me on the back end. He is a consultant for a couple of different international education organizations focusing on internships. So Melkin will be monitoring the Q&A function, which I would suggest and encourage. If anyone has any questions or comments, please put it in the Q&A, and Melkin will curate that and ask those questions probably towards the end of our session. So the last 15 minutes we will have open for a Q&A from the field. But if it's entirely relevant to what we're talking about at the moment, then we'll do our best to ask your question of the panelists as well. So let's talk about the panelists. So I just wanted to introduce them at one at a time. So Sarah Sabourin is the Manager of Employment and Partnership Development at Carleton University here in Ottawa, Canada. We also have Colette Plum, who is the Assistant Dean for the University of California Berkeley Study Abroad. And she's calling in from Berkeley, California. So it's a little bit earlier for her. And she's already voted, which is fantastic. We have Colin Lalonde from the International Experience Canada program. We've just heard a little bit from Colin, and we're going to hear some of the anecdotal and some of the data that he's come across in the program that he helps to analyze. We have Oluwatoyin Sodipe, who is the CEO at SESEWA in Nigeria. So Toyin, I have to give a little bit of a plug to, because she's one of the success stories when it comes to internships. She was an intern at her organization that she is now the CEO in. So that's a success that we always like to hear as people who have placed students into internship programs. And we also, last but not least, we have Tony Rogge, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Gardme International Insurance. And Tony formerly was with the University of Manitoba and has been sort of on both sides of the coin. And so I welcome everyone, everyone to the panel. And I'll start off the discussion with my first question, which is, we've heard anecdotally that students have returned to international travel in huge numbers. What, if anything, has changed in the students' mindsets as they think about their own well-being on study abroad or work integrated learning programs? And so I'm going to throw this first question to Sarah to kick us off. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Matt. So yes, it is true. Students are very eager to be having these experiences after having a few years without it. This past summer at Carleton University, we were able to reopen our international internship program for international travel, and our students were ecstatic. They were so excited. For many of them, they had been waiting and postponing this experience. It's connected to their academics and their graduation requirements. So from the student perspective, they were in advance quite excited. They weren't thinking about the risks. They weren't thinking about the other pieces. They were just excited. On our end, things, of course, we were rapidly navigating additional pre-departure considerations, additional supports and whatnot. But things were a little different this summer when it came to our first cohort being abroad. So typically we always track the incidents or situations that we support students through when they're abroad. And typically we plan for approximately 10% of our students to have some type of a challenge when they're abroad. This year we saw a much higher rate of our students having challenges or situations that required our intervention. So that was a shift for us, absolutely. And those situations ranged from, some that we had planned for. So, hospitalizations and situations with COVID, challenges with the travel industry and readiness for travel. So visa delays and challenges, but then other situations that, there was a wide range, challenges within the workplace, other important, other serious sicknesses such as malaria, et cetera. So we did find we were supporting students quite frequently this summer. The other thing that we noticed was a shift in the resiliency of our students. So when they were abroad, we were engaging in, situations that in the past we hadn't typically engaged so frequently in. On the spectrum of situations that we would see, usually we would see more major emergencies or higher level escalated situations. This year we found ourselves engaged in situations, roommate conflicts that had escalated over levels of cleanliness. And, this was new territory for us. And while it may seem minor to us on this end compared to some of the other situations we're seeing for our students, these were still major situations and required that same level of intervention. One thing that I will say we shifted with as we prepared for our students, and that we're going to maintain in the long term, as we prepared for our students to go abroad, and I think seeing that shift in resiliency, it will be especially important for us to continue, is we introduced a travel risk management assignment. So in the past, we would offer a lot of training to our students where we brought in experts to talk about risk mitigation, et cetera. This year, in addition to that, we put the onus on our students and engaged them in their own risk mitigation planning. And so they were reviewing the laws, expectations, supports available in country. They had to map out plans should they need to evacuate the country. They had to look into details such as the nearest Canadian embassy. So we did add that, and it was helpful because it engaged them in that process, but it's also something we will continue long term.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So, Colette, I'm interested to hear if you're seeing similar things, or you've experienced some other out of the box ways of thinking of your students and some of their experiences.
Very much so. Really, what Sarah was just sharing really resonated with what we were experiencing with our Berkeley students this summer. Like you said, Sarah, the students were so ready to get back. They weren't thinking about risk necessarily. They were just wanting to get out in the world again. And in a really positive way, what we saw is that they were just really engaged, trying to make the most of their time abroad. And sometimes to their detriment, there are students that take on 2 internships, one under the table in addition to the one, or that were adding online courses to their experience. They were being really, really ambitious because I think they were also feeling the pressure to have everything, they could get from their undergraduate experience in a more condensed period of time. We also saw some increased attention to things like health and fitness, where students were wanting to identify local gyms for exercise and things that we just hadn't really thought would be on the radar of students, was definitely there. That said, there were really, COVID was not behind us this summer. There were really heightened concerns about COVID. And one thing that we really saw was that in Berkeley in particular, the students were coming from an environment where masking was still the norm. Students were really accustomed to there being protocols around COVID, and they were good citizen practitioners of this. And they were arriving in places where it felt like the pandemic was something in the past, and they quickly stepped into that, which was great for, they had a great experience. But what we found is that students completely freaked out when the first COVID cases in a cohort appeared, as if they'd never been told that this would happen. We tried to prep them and they forgot all about it. They went really local, and then they completely, we had students that really could not manage COVID once the first case appeared in a cohort. So we really learned that we, have to be very clear with expectations, which we thought we were, but I think also really better outline the support and protocols, what things will look like when something happens, so students know that there's a plan and can lean into that when things don't go the way that they want. And just one other thing I'm going to add is that we were dealing with many more interventionist parents than ever. And that's probably a product of many students, this is the first time away from home, not just studying abroad. It was their first time. They had they'd only had a brief period outside of their homes. And so they were actually, some of students were expecting their parents to advocate for them instead of themselves being very proactive. And one example that a local provider shared with me, that there was a parent who was actually copied into a work email between a student and their supervisor. The student was disagreeing with something the supervisor wanted, and they actually copied a parent into the work email, which was a first.
Well, that's interesting, but I guess that goes in step with the previous 2 years, where many students were in the same house as their parents and were online if they were in an education situation. So I guess it goes to reason that probably continues a little bit. How about you, Tony? What are you seeing from an insurance provider's standpoint?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Tony, and I'm in Winnipeg, which is on the land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So a little bit different from Colin, but we also like to acknowledge that as well. It's been a very, very, very interesting year for us as an insurer. We don't, as a model, generally, we're not dealing day to day with students on the front end in terms of their purchasing of our product. We actually sell through institutions. So a lot of the discourse and a lot of the conversations we've been having have been directly with our partners in the K-12, the college, and the university sector, all of whom are anxious to get back out into the world. So that sort of sense of anxiety as we transition from our dark and crazy COVID times, and everyone sort of very happy to try and get back to a new normal. We've been having a lot of conversations. And I think in a way, kind of looking at COVID-19 as almost a critical juncture in terms of the overall reassessment of the duty of care that institutions have to their students, and by extension to the parents who often pay for the students to participate in these programs. And then defining a new standard of care that everyone can live with, at an affordable rate. And to remind people again that an insurance policy is not a magic bullet solution to every problem in the world. And I remember this very well from being at the University of Manitoba and Thompson Rivers University, having managed large study abroad programs, formal bilateral exchanges, internships, service learning, really sort of helping people focus on how a travel, health, and insurance policy is only one part of a proper, well-developed, well-defined risk management strategy, and having conversations with students that sort of, again, help them recognize that when you're going to go overseas, no matter how short or how long, or whether it's a simple sort of conference or student competition, or whether it's a service learning program in a remote rural area, you really have to help students go through that discussion, looking at the difference between having them just in a little sort of comfort zone bubble and having them sort of think that everything's panic stations, and really enhancing that learning zone that resides in between the comfort zone and the panic zone, and really drilling down to what students need to do to manage their health, safety, and well-being, and thinking of their insurance policy as a backup plan for certain kinds of things. So again, a lot of people have been asking us about COVID-19. That's their sort of first entry point, but then it's drilling down into all those other things. Which adventure activities are actually covered in your policy and which aren't, which are excluded? How do we deal with other illnesses? What if we have an accident? What if we have a security related event and we need to transport people home for a non-medical reason? What kind of coverage exists in the market now? What can we purchase in order to cover our bases if and when something like that happens? So it's really kind of coming full circle and having these conversations, kind of learning the vocabulary, the grammar for having those discussions, and thinking of it as in my opinion, risk management as a learning outcome.
Fantastic. So to follow on some of what the first panelists were saying, we've heard anecdotally that mental health issues are on the rise at all levels of education. My wife is an elementary school teacher, so I've certainly heard of issues in her school related to mental health and just sort of a pandemic hangover, if you will. And so are you seeing more students with mental health wellness concerns who wish to do an international experience or an international internship? And how are you addressing those concerns with pre-departure, on-program, and post-program initiatives? So I'm going to go back to Tony, partly because I know that GARDME has a program for mental wellness, either domestically or internationally. So I'll throw it over to you, Tony, just to give some thoughts.
Right. Okay. The short answer to the question is yes. Again, whether it's institutionally or at the student level or the instructor level, the group leader level, there are a lot of questions now about how do we manage and plan for health and wellness in terms of mental health, and being able to provide support to group leaders when and if a student is having some degree of anxiety overseas. We know that traveling overseas in many cases can actually help, or it facilitates, a lot of emotional reactions. And in some cases, those can influence the way a student experiences their trip overseas, and will have a sort of a downstream effect on a group, and can disrupt a group, and can put a lot of pressure on a group leader. So they're looking for resources. They're looking for resources both within their institution, but through programs like our own, the Keep Me Safe mental health and wellness program, to support both the students themselves, but also the group leaders, the professor, the instructors, which have a lot of other obligations on a day-to-day basis, not the least of which is having to deal with something if there's an episode of some kind, or if there's a traumatic event, and then there's support required. So again, I'd absolutely say that yes, we're getting a lot of questions, and people are, again, as part of this whole process of reevaluating and the evolving duty of care and the standard of care that they're searching for and looking for those resources from us or other providers or in their community.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to go across the ocean and bring in Toyin to give us your perspective on your organization and the students that you serve. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you do in Nigeria and what you've observed with your students in regards to mental wellness and some of the internship programs.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Just like Tony said, I think we've also really seen a rise in terms of mental wellness. And I think the reason why this is this part of the world in Nigeria, mental health conversations, we've not had them in a while, right? It's been more of a culturally shaming conversation. So we hardly even talk about it. So I think that what has happened with us now is there are more people experiencing it. So we've had to put a name on what it's called, which is there is something called mental health. People need to understand that it's a thing, the same way we have the physical health, the emotional health, we have something called, mental wellness. And, some of the things that we've seen with our students and with our interns, how this has, come on the rise. So we've had examples like mismatch of skills, right? When what they studied in school versus what is readily available for them in the job market. We also have lack of support from parents because some people are studying courses that they really want to study, but they don't get a lot of support from their parents. And this means that there's heavy financial responsibilities on them. We have some students who are breadwinners, who are so self-sponsored, and that's really hard on a student's mental health or an intern's mental health. There's also the challenge of uncertainty to completing their degree. For example, in Nigeria, our students have just returned from a 250-day strike. That's like almost 9 months. So they've been sitting at home for 9 months and they've just gone back to school. And so it's even hard for them to concentrate because they're like, we can go home anytime from now. There can be another strike, right? I've had to experience almost a year strike when I was in school. So a lot of these things would be a challenge why students are experiencing more mental health issues. And what are some of the things that we've done to address it? I think the first thing for us is to really increase the awareness, like I said earlier, to say there is something called mental health. And it doesn't make you lesser than any other person. It's a thing. We have to talk about it in our schools, in our homes, in our organizations. We have packages, we have therapists, we have, what do I call it now? We have resources that can help that are specifically designed for mental health issues, just like any other issues. We've also done a lot of counseling and coaching for our students, where we're just giving them resources, getting them to talk to someone, whatever they need. Also monthly check-ins and evaluations, the expectations they set for their internships. Are they meeting the expectations? How is their health in the workplace? Are they being satisfied with the kind of work they're doing and with who they're also doing the work? Because it's important that you're doing work that you love and you're also sort of doing it with people that you love to do it with. So that's really been the experience on our end. And, we've seen a lot of improvement in that area as well.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So I'll throw it over to you, Colette, and maybe you can give us your perspective or your students' perspective. I know that UC Berkeley has a diverse student population, and the diversity is right across of race and economics and nationality. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how the students and the administration has approached mental well-being.
Thank you, Matt. Well, a lot of this is really resonating. So one thing that we have seen that has been interesting is that students do seem to have an increased vocabulary and awareness of mental health issues. And that's been pretty refreshing, actually. There seems to be an increase in students who are already in therapy or in counseling at the time that they are applying for programs and wish to continue that while they are abroad. And with the escalation, I think, of virtual therapy that has happened during the pandemic, this is the first time historically anyway that I've seen where that's actually possible, that we've been able to tell students to work with them on some continuation of their therapy or of their counseling while they're abroad, which is a new thing for us. That said, there is still stigma around mental health, and it can be difficult to get students to disclose. We still have cases where something will happen on a program and we discover it's the first time we know of a mental health history that a student has been working with. One thing that we have done is system-wide, the University of California has expanded the student travel insurance coverage to include remote counseling sessions and 24/7 mental health access. There's been a real expansion within the industry as a whole of the types of resources that are available for mental health, and system-wide, we've availed ourselves of that. After much advocacy, I would say, from the campuses that we were all starting to see this as a need. And I think that it's been really important, again, to be dealing with this both pre-departure on the program itself and post-program. And we've done this, we have a health clearance process, but as I said, not everybody discloses. We do the same kind of pre-departure workshops that incorporate resilience skills and that sort of thing. But we've also really tried to have students create student-only Slack channels, building community early on, and that seems to has been helpful for students as well. We do check-ins with the students on site, and we also do re-entry workshops for students as they return.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And so I mentioned sort of a diverse campus. I think one of the things that we as a group, as a field, really want to see is more diversity, equity, and inclusion in our study abroad and international programs. So that leads me to the next question. Is it becoming more diverse? And how is your organization and its partners adapting to meet the needs of a more diverse group of students? So I'm going to send it over to Colin. Maybe you can provide the insight that you've gained through the International Experience Canada program. Over to you, Colin.
Thanks, Matt. So as I was saying earlier, the program's for people between 18 and 35. So we're not just students. Our population of folks who work on this is already coming from pretty diverse backgrounds and life cycle experiences. But the issue of inclusivity within the program is obviously a problem, as it is everywhere, and we're trying to address those things. And IEC as a program and its scope is limited in what we can do directly in this space. But that's why we have an engagement strategy that we're trying to make as inclusive as possible. And part of that is research and dissemination of that information in platforms like this. And my focus has specifically been on LGBTQ engagement. And in some of our recent research, we found that our LGBTQ travelers within Canada have very significant barriers and concerns than the average Canadian youth. For instance, we see significantly more concern about safety. So we're roughly like 60% identify safety as a barrier to traveling abroad versus 35. And that's, like everybody was saying, since a increase in the general public's concern with safety. So that persistent gap of higher concern continues to exist. Financial challenges are even higher, with 70% identifying it versus 50%. And more concerns about isolation and loneliness and finding accommodations in affirming workplaces abroad. And so since the scope of what we can do directly is limited, we work with partnership development, and we're trying to create a network of stakeholders who are both within Canada to help foreign youth who come to Canada and Canadians abroad to create networks of exchange and support to identifying safe and affirming workplaces, finding housing solutions for folks while they're out there. And we want to be able to create planning tools to inform youth to put forward the considerations they need to make sure that they're having safe and affirming experiences abroad.
Great. So I'm going to throw it over to Sarah to give the perspective that you're seeing and more broadly at Carleton University amongst your students.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is an important conversation, and it's diversity, and the diversity, inclusivity, and accessibility of our programs is a priority for Carleton. But I think it's also really important to note that it is something, as it is for everyone here, but I think it's important to note that this is something that we continuously are working towards improving, and we really rely on, you know, expertise we have on campus, but also in the field as we continue to reassess our inclusivity and accessibility. That being said, I do think we have made some strides in the past couple of years. The one way in which we did was actually through funding through the Canadian government. So Employment and Social Development Canada and with Universities Canada created a Global Opportunities skills program. And the intent of this program was to reduce the barriers for Canadian university and college students when it comes to outbound mobility, specifically students who are specifically low income students, students who identify as having a disability, and Indigenous students. At Carleton, we were very fortunate that our application was successful, and as a result, we've been able to work more directly in engaging these different populations and providing significant bursaries to help offset the cost to engage in these experiences, as well as additional supports. The other way that we've seen some movement is through our virtual programming. So like many programs at the start of the pandemic, we quickly pivoted to virtual programming. And I will be the first to admit we did not have high hopes for this. Seeing the value of these in-person experiences, we didn't have high hopes. However, the student feedback and the learning outcomes were quite strong when it came to career outcomes, and students were still developing their intercultural competencies. And the feedback has since been that we maintain this. So students are keen to see this as a long-term option, which just provides a more financially accessible option for some students to have these rich career and international experiences, and they can self-select which is a better fit for them. As we were reviewing in preparation for engaging with these audiences as outlined with the Global Skills Opportunities funding, we really we wanted to make sure that we were ready to best support these populations before engaging with them. And so we worked with the expertise we had on campus in terms of, so for example, our students with disabilities. Before engaging with those students, we really worked with those on campus who have expertise in accessibility, and we reviewed all of our practices and all of our policies to ensure they were as accessible as possible. And we made certain improvements, such as, in the pre-departure planning phase, there's now an addition where we encourage all students to really reflect on and share the unique needs they may have that will allow them to be the most successful in this program. In some cases, that looks like an accommodation for their workplace. In some cases, that's support with a disclosure conversation with their employer partner. But in other cases, it's something completely different, around medication, the availability of their medication in country. And so what we've found is that by making our programs more accessible for this audience, as a byproduct, we've supported all of our students in being more engaged or being more successful. And then the last thing I'll say is we try to be as proactive as we can, but inevitably situations are going to pop up that have us, reacting in the moment. And in those instances, we really are just working closely with our partners and the students themselves and the units on campus. So we had a situation this summer, for example, where a student was in a workplace, and through one of our check-ins, and because our team creates such an environment where there's open dialogue with our students, we learned that the student who identified with one particular cultural group I guess when they were in the placement, their supervisor shared that same identification, and it shifted the nature of their work. And they were being asked to write articles in support of this cultural group and against another cultural group. And naturally, the student was quite uncomfortable. And so it was a delicate situation to navigate, but we had the student in the driver's seat the whole time, where they wanted, they were leading how we approached this. We engaged very quickly with our partners, who fortunately had a diversity and inclusion officer present at all the meetings, and we really navigated next steps for the student. In this case, ultimately, it resulted in us finding a new work opportunity for the student, and our partners then debriefed and educated that employer partner and dealt with the next steps on their end. But it is, I think the key takeaways there is we can be as proactive as possible, but there are still going to be situations that are unique and unplanned where we need to react. And we really just want to lean on the resources available to us.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Toyin, can you give us your perspective of diversity and inclusion as it relates to your students that are on programs in Nigeria?
Great, thank you, Matt. I think I'm just going to speak more as regards home-based internships, because that's where we have a lot of experience.
Yep.
Yes, we've seen a lot of diversity, increase in diversity and inclusion. In terms of, if I were to mention one, an example would be increase in female participation, right? So we've had a lot of organizations in the past. The female gender has always had to take the backseat when it comes to internship placements. You have more males applying for internships, and then you sometimes have organizations requesting for more males. But now the conversation is changing, where we have equal number of males and females getting internships. And if we have organizations who are still requesting for a particular gender, we get to sensitize them, and let them know the importance of having this diverse community. Another thing we've had is the school-specific interns. For example, an organization requesting for interns from a particular school. And I think why this is interesting is because, again, where we come from here in Nigeria, one of the challenges that we face is our educational system, right? And I know we're really working on it. We've done a lot of work, but we still have organizations saying, I think that students from these schools are much more better inclined. I want students from this school, but then it doesn't give students from other schools the opportunity to access the internships, the work experience. We don't get to know the level of brilliance. So we've done more in terms of sensitization, continuously having conversations on why we need to be more diverse in school selection, and also increase in female participation. One initiative that we also came up with is the MBA internships. And, just following what Sarah said about how virtual internships has really, really worked for us. So we started the MBA internship program, and it's simply us matching MBA students with organizations across the world. So we have some areas in Nigeria that are high risk, high security locations that people cannot travel to. So what we have is MBA students from all across the world are still able to join these organizations, provide solutions for them without having to travel there physically. So we've had a lot of students from Alt Business School, Wharton Business School, and all of those schools, having their internships with locally based organization. And I think that's been really interesting for us as an organization.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Toyin. I do want to leave some time for questions from the audience, but I do want to ask one quick question, and I'd appreciate if the panelists could keep their answers fairly short and concise. And it's really piggybacking on something Sarah was saying about medication in country. I've heard anecdotally about transgender students who are either going on programs or have considered going on programs who would have issues acquiring hormone therapy supplies in the country, whether it's either they can't get the like for like of the hormone, or they would have issues importing the hormones that they have as part of their treatment. So I'm going to send it over to Colin to maybe talk about that a little bit. and to see if you've heard of any incidents and maybe a best practice in relation to that.
Sure thing. Yeah, I mean, it's an emerging area of knowledge for us, as it is for a lot of organizations. But we heard from youth who've gone on the experience before, who were very energetic and excited to go on this adventure. That, you know, they got out there and they were limited to 3 months supply of their hormone therapy and had to return home. And when you've got a work permit that allows you to work somewhere for 2 years and you're limited to 3 months, that's a problem. And so, you know, now they're trying to figure out how they'll maybe even be able to smuggle it in. That's not a solution to this problem, but we are trying to figure out with stakeholders out in this field, how can we better support them? We're hearing interesting whispers of online delivery of service that seem interesting, but at the same time, we're not sure how this works for skirting around these barriers to entry at the border. So, I mean, as I said, it's an emerging area. There's a lot more work, and I'd be really interested to hear from other folks what they're working on in that space.
Great. Tony, I'm going to throw it over to you from an insurance perspective. How is GuardMe approaching that, if you've had experience with it?
Well, we have, although that experience is almost exclusively limited to the inbound scenario rather than outbound. And it's very complex. I agree with Colin. It's it's sensitive. It's an emerging area. I think there's more questions than answers as a general rule, as people sort of, you know, have conversations about what is fair and reasonable to expect in terms of how an insurer or an individual would plan for their treatment when they go overseas or when they arrive in Canada. You know, I would say one observation I'd have is that companies like GuardMe, there are many insurers, you know, we're able to respond to requests that come from communities of institutions and stakeholders when they believe it's a priority. And as sectors, whether it's K-12, university, or colleges, if coverage for that kind of a treatment is important to the institutions, I think as a whole, they should have those conversations so that they can begin to have meaningful dialogue with companies like our own. Because at the end of the day, the way things are currently done, you know, when you're looking at a standard policy, it's simply not costed to include that type of therapy. And so once you start having that conversation, you can begin to sort of determine, you know, if there's a genuine interest in making that treatment covered. And thereafter, you know, all of the other questions about what happens if it's just one institution that provides it and not the other. How does that affect you as an institution and all the downstream impacts of being a destination of choice, if you will? So those are some high level observations, but it's very emerging and it's very new for us, and it's almost exclusively on the inbound side.
And how about you, Colette? What, if anything, are you seeing or hearing from your student population?
And this is such an important question. And I have to say, I would love to get with my team and run some data on this. I'm wondering if this isn't showing up because I'm just curious if our students that might be in need of this therapy are choosing shorter term programs and opting into that instead of dealing with this additional barrier. I will say, just to keep it really short, that as you all know, are very aware, these are not the only obstacles that we have that trans and non-gender conforming, gender non-conforming students are dealing with. And so what we've really tried to do is we've expanded our application process itself to ask more relevant questions about gender, including pronouns and lived names, and to generally prioritize inclusion of trans and gender non-conforming students in our programs, working with providers, making sure that we have gender inclusive housing options, and educating faculty and having plenty of support for these students.
Well, when and if you do, I'm sure it's when, not if, when you crunch those numbers, if you could share it with me, I'm happy to share it with everyone who has attended this today, because I think, well, I think the common theme is this is an emerging situation, and we all need to know more and sort of, you know, adjust our approach based on the need. So thank you for the panel for answering my questions. So I know that there's some questions from the audience. So I'm going to throw it over to Melquin to ask some of the questions, and we'll see what comes of that.
Awesome, thank you, Matt. So we do have a few questions coming in related to resources and training. The first one that I think would be good to address, sort of a follow-up to mental health. Are there any services that you all provide to your students, or are they separate services that you provide to your students? And how do you sort of manage that communication with them while they're abroad? Maybe if we can throw it over to Sarah and then Colette and take it from there.
Sure. So at Carleton, we have mental health services that are available to students virtually. So where possible, we connect students to those resources if needed abroad. Additionally, we work with a third-party partner who provides health, safety, and security advice. And part of that resource is mental health advice. So if a student is abroad and in crisis when it comes to their mental health, that is the first resource we would recommend to them. Again, these are more, resources that we're connecting students with, in the moment in a reactive sort of setting. But usually we rely on, proactive approaches and planning with the student in advance.
Similarly, Berkeley, we have campus resources, and as I mentioned before, our insurance also has a pretty robust resources for students. And we've become, I think it's become pretty standard now that whenever we're dealing with a student conduct issue, it doesn't just necessarily have to be a specifically mental health issue, but whenever we're engaging with a student in a way that we know might be creating additional anxiety or mental health stress for them, we're always following up with an email that directs them towards resources, invites them to have conversations. Yeah, and I think that that's become a really important part of our care of students.
Awesome, thank you. And Tony, do you have anything to add from the insurance perspective?
Well, I just say that there are lots of resources and tools that different partners are using. Third-party providers on the security and medical evacuation side, on the mental health side. There's also, we work with a company called iSent. Many of the institutions in Canada have already been using iSent as a mobile handheld app for inbound students. But that app is now also being flexed and applied with many, many modules specifically for the outbound experience. And it's something that, again, whether they work with a company like our own or others, the iSent app is now being used to help facilitate communication with students when they're overseas and connect them directly with campus resources.
Great, thank you. And another question that we have is related to technologies. I know that, Colette, you mentioned that you all use Slack for some of the communication with your students. And we're wondering what type of other media do you use? Email, WhatsApp, what typically is the best way to communicate with your students while they're abroad? And sort of addressing some of the concerns or issues that are arising while they're on their experience.
Well, I'm happy to just jump in here really quickly. Just two things I'll flag. One is that WhatsApp just seems to be, every program seems to have a WhatsApp group. And in addition to Slack, there's WhatsApp has become a really, has been very important means of communication. And I just want to flag one thing is that we have been challenged with communication with students doing virtual programs. It just seems to be we have less places to catch them and catch their attention. And we even had a case this summer where a student just kind of disappeared, and we had to work through campus with our students of concern to finally determine that the student was perfectly fine and had just chosen to not participate any longer in the internship and had to be withdrawn. So we're having to find creative ways, including emergency contacts at times, to communicate with students.
I noticed there's one question about an interventionist parent, and I privately wonder if this is like a North American Western phenomenon or not. So I would love for Toyin to give us her experience and perspective on this. Is this something that you experience with your young people and students, that their parents are becoming very involved in some of the internship programs, or is this something that we're seeing more in sort of Europe and North America? I would love to have your perspective on that.
I think it's interesting because I think we have lesser parent intervention. How interesting that is. I mean, in the previous weeks or in the past years, we've had a lot of parents, getting in the business of their kids. They want to know how they're doing in school. They want to know what they're studying. They want to know where they're getting their work placements. But I think that a lot of things have changed on this side. And I think sometimes it's also very peculiar to where we come from. I know I talk about where we come from a lot, but if I say so myself, Nigerians are quite very resilient, or at this part of the world in Africa. And so we've had to take a lot of responsibilities at a very early age. So you see students who are self-sponsored, who go and get jobs by themselves, who have little or no parent intervention in where they work, who they work with, but would say really making the right decision. So we've had less of parent interventions. We have more students taking ownership of their learning and their career journey. And I think it's really interesting to see that. Just few cases of parent intervention, really.
So I wonder, is the lesson here that places like Carleton and UC Berkeley need more Nigerian students? Is that what I'm hearing? we did talk a little bit about resiliency earlier in the call. So Colette, you said that word, or maybe it was Sarah that said a word, so I apologize. But do either one of you have just something to add with the resiliency and how we can maybe build our students up to be a bit more resilient?
I'll just share really briefly that I found it to be super helpful to really coach both parents and students out of being included together in meetings. And one way that I frame it up for parents is that every time they step in to save their child from something, they're denying a really important, could be the most important learning opportunity that that child has to advocate for themselves and to build trust within the communities that are there to care for them. And I found the parents really respond to that. If they think that they're actually depriving their child of an opportunity, this is often what this is about. They want their children to have opportunities, that seems to resonate with them.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think zeroes right in on this concept of really sort of making this whole process part of maybe not a part of the syllabus in terms of a learning objective of a course, but as a whole of student approach, right? Like, building resilience and confidence and good decision making, thinking longer term, those short term, long term trade-offs as a sort of a student development piece. I think those are really important conversations to have. And as a parent with, two teenagers who are also starting to think about traveling, as much as I try to sort of be on the sidelines and coach them in the right places, I also know intuitively that they have to make these decisions and have to be, they have to own it. They really do.
Great. I know that we're at time, and if I can indulge the panel, if you're available to stay around for one more question, I'd appreciate it. If you have to get off, that's fine as well. But Malcolm, can I ask you just to ask one more question, and then we'll conclude?
Yes. The last question is related to training. What type of training do you all think is important for international education staff that they should be taking during this time as it relates to the topic student wellness and international travel security? And do you all have any types of trainings that you all have been implementing in your institutions that you think are worth sharing with the group? And maybe we could start off this question with Sarah, if that's all right.
Sure, and this is an important question, and I think I'm curious to hear the answers of others as well, because I think it's something we can continue to work towards. Right now, in terms of trainings that we engage, one of the primary ways we have at Carleton is a student support certificate, and it's intended for anyone who works in a student support capacity. And there's a range of training sessions that they can engage, and they're encouraged to engage in to better support students through a range of issues. So we have ones that focus on our Indigenous community and education around that, ones that focus on student well-being and mental health, et cetera. And so those have been really helpful for our teams in terms of navigating the student emergencies that pop up, but also in the planning and development of our programs. Of course, I think it's important to continue to participate in sessions such as this, because, it's such a niche area we're working in that, and we're, as we've discussed today, we're dealing with some unique situations. So I think where possible, I know at least, budgets can be challenging to get out to these different conferences. So opportunities such as this can be really impactful. So yeah, but I am curious to hear the answers from others, because it's something we always want to build upon.
I'm happy to jump in here. At Berkeley, we have a really kind of robust system, our campus-wide advising kind of a community of practice. And so there's a weekly update that goes around for advising and student services with all kinds of resources. There are regular meetings where advising circles where people are experts are brought in to address particular student development concerns or raise awareness and provide resources for particular student populations as well. And I will say that one thing that I have found really helpful in the study abroad world most recently is that we have come together, program directors throughout University of California, and also we're part of Pac-12. The directors meet regularly, like twice a month. And we also have a standing kind of risk meeting on Fridays where people can pop in. It's kind of an open agenda, pop in if they have, year round now it is, concerns around building programs in certain locales, or if there's a particularly pressing emergency that's going on where we can all kind of brainstorm and learn together as well.
Thank you, Sarah and Colette. Is there anyone else who would like to add your perspective before we end the session for today? Alrighty then, I guess I'll throw it over to Matt to conclude.
Well, thank you very much. Just as the sun has come out and hit me right in the face here. Well, I wanted to thank everyone on the panel for being here today. You've provided great insight and perspective. I wanted to thank International Experience Canada for sponsoring this. This truly can't happen without their sponsorship and their leadership in the field. And I want to thank the audience for taking time out of your day. I know everyone's super busy. There's quite a few Americans that registered today, and I know it's election day there. And I thank you for being part of this. I encourage you to check out our website and to consider attending the International Internship Conference in June of 2023. But we're also going to have another speaker session either in December or early January. And once again, that will be brought to you by International Experience Canada, and it will be free. So it's a great resource for you. And if anyone would like to follow up with myself or with Colin with regards to the International Experience Canada program, please, here is our contact information, and please reach out to us. But once again, I really want to thank our panel for volunteering their time today. And it's been great to have perspectives from across the ocean, across borders, and across different fields and providers as it relates to international internships, study abroad, and international education. So with that, I will conclude our session today. And oh, sorry, Malcolm, I want to thank you as well. He did some of the graphics on the back end. He did a great job curating the Q&A. And he just so everyone knows, not to feel sorry for him, he lives in Chile, but he's currently residing in France. So he has a special place in my heart because he's an intrepid traveler himself. So, so on that note, I will end today's session. I want to thank everyone again and wish you a rest of a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you soon. Bye now.